We're here again today to look into the last chapter of the book of Mark, and very familiar story. We've just come through the whole Passion Week and the resurrection being forefront in our minds, and we're just going to sort of finish off here just a few thoughts. And one key is just looking at some of the people that are involved here. Of course, we've just looked at Joseph of Arimathea, who provided the tomb for Jesus to be placed in. But then we begin to, as we get into chapter 16, we begin to see several others. It mentions Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, those three at least. A little bit later on, you see that Jesus has called attention to not just his disciples, he wanted the ladies to tell them, but also it specifies Peter, so that's significant in my mind as well, since Peter was the one that had denied him. And then the other two that were on the road to Emmaus, and then the 11, it mentions in verse 14. He's dealt with all of them at some point, and of course Thomas would be another one, not mentioned here specifically in this particular gospel. But so we have several different ones, and the key thoughts of these different people, and why did Jesus deal with them as he did, or why did God see fit even to include, for example, the women there in that first verse? Why would they have been the ones to know first off that Jesus had risen, or at least that the tomb was empty? They may not have comprehended it all, and if you start looking through this, one sort of common theme seems to be they didn't believe it. And the fact is, then you get to verse 14, and that's exactly what Jesus dealt with. He said, you wouldn't believe this. That may have been common in those days as far as women are concerned. My understanding is that they were not allowed to stand as a witness in a court of law. And perhaps the disciples just felt like, well, their testimony can't be relied upon or whatever, just, their cultural mindset. But anyway, Jesus got after them for not being willing to believe, and I think it's appropriate for us to at least call attention to that. I don't want to point fingers too much, because we often may have our own issues with belief and faith when it's hard to believe. But Jesus did caution them about that, or upbraid them, it says here in verse 14. So there's several different people that are involved, and that's important for us to notice. And then when you begin to look also, what was the one thing that even throughout Jesus' interaction with people here on earth while he was here, one common thing was, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. It was the angel's message even to Mary early on when Jesus was just foretold. And then later on, maybe it's on the Sea of Galilee, or maybe somebody whose loved one has died or is at least very sick. And different times he'd say, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. And so right here, I know it's a slightly different reading here in verse 6. Then, actually verse 5 says, and they were affrighted, or afraid. And then this young man sitting there in the sepulchre said, be not affrighted, ye seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He is risen, he is not here. Behold the place where they laid him. And of course, one of the natural aspects is if we can't tell that Jesus is here, or we don't know that he's involved in our situation, it's easy to become afraid. But as the angel said here, he's risen. He's not here. He's not laid there in the tomb. He's not dead. But you don't have to be afraid, because Jesus is alive and well. And I know it's hard for us to remember that in our times of need, but I just remind you today that whatever you may be facing, you don't need to be afraid, because he's here. He's alive and well, no longer dead, but he is on the throne. And of course, then they hurried off and they were telling the others about this. And again, I would just remind you, well, actually, I mentioned earlier Mary Magdalene, but it mentions her again in verse 9, and then says here how he had cast 7 devils out of her. And so again, maybe a little bit of an unusual candidate to have that special favor. But Jesus wanted to give special acknowledgement there and appearing to her first. And then, of course, you have these others as well. And for today, anyway, I just want us to remember that we don't have to be afraid because He is alive. And whether you see His hand at work, whether you get that special visit from God, and I understand our day is a little bit different, and maybe we don't have that personal touch like these disciples did, or even these women did, but we can still know that He's here and that He cares about us. And of course, He's given us a job to do. I think we'll just kind of sum it up real quickly next time when we look at Jesus' words just before He went away into heaven and the task that He has given us. But before we have a task, we also need to recognize that we have a triumphant Christ, and He is alive, and He's well, you might say. He's on the throne. He's doing whatever He sees fit to do, and we can trust Him. And so for this episode anyway of this Bible study here in Mark, and just as we near the end, I want us just to remember that He is still trustworthy, and we can do His task because we know that He is on the throne. Well, thank you for joining us again today. God bless you, and we'll hope to finish up next time.